So maybe there's something about like directing our own sexuality, including in places like towards death. Because like a sexual attraction to death is a very bizarre thing to, I don't even consider, and yet I think that's at the heart of this movie. It's very goth too, right?
Yes. Welcome, friends, to episode 335 of the Ink to Film podcast, where we read the book and then see the movie. I'm filmmaker James Bailey.
And I'm writer Luke Elliott.
And this week we discuss Robert Eggers' 2024 film, Nosferatu. So, in the intervening time since our last episode, which was our Francis Ford Coppola's Bram Stoker's Dracula, from 1992, mouthful of a title. But since then, we also recorded a bonus episode for the original Nosferatu from 1922.
Right. And what's the director's name for that one?
Murnau.
Murnau. Okay, Murnau.
Yeah.
I'm just going to refer to that as the Murnau film if we need to refer to it.
Sure. Or you can call it Nosferatu, a symphony of horror.
Right, because that would be easier.
Yeah. It's Murnau, I guess. Murnau.
Well, much like Bram and Nosferatu and Nosferatu, I don't know how any of this is pronounced, and I'm just going to do it differently every time, and sometimes it'll be right, sometimes it'll be wrong. Oh, well.
Yeah. The reason I bring up that original film is this is not necessarily an adaptation of Dracula, because we talked about in that bonus episode, just to give some context, Nosferatu was like an unsanctioned, without copyright adaptation of Dracula, and then names were changed, and then honestly the I think sort of the point of the story is changed to an extent in Nosferatu as well. Yeah. So that's cool to see like this carrying forward. There's a reason why Robert Eggers didn't create a Dracula film. He's creating a Nosferatu film, which is very wrapped up and tied into like, you know, film history and horror history, because this is like one of the most notable horror films ever. And then we talked about a little bit about German Expressionism in that bonus episode, but how important that movement was to horror movies and genre movies. And here we are now talking about Robert Eggers' film, which we've just been anxiously anticipating since like Christmas of last year.
So, I want to like put this out there because like I realize this episode might be some people's first time ever listening to Ink to Film. So I always want to keep that in mind. So we have done a series of episodes now on Dracula, the other Nosferatu, as we've talked about, and the Francis Ford Coppola Dracula. So all of these different versions, and has been leading up to this, sort of the thing we've had in our sights all along. And it has been a really fascinating process of adaptation that we've seen just pieces of. Of course, we participate in culture, outside of the podcast, so I know about other Dracula adaptations. I know about other vampire adaptations, but this is such a interesting and profound version of adaptation because what you just talked about, it had an iconic film made in the 1920s that itself was sort of forced to change in order to try and avoid being an official adaptation.
And if I might note, it was scheduled to be destroyed. It should have been destroyed by all accounts, but some prints slipped through into the international market, and it's been since restored, and it's just has this crazy significance.
Right, and then that film became a almost like foundational piece of cinema, really, or like at least horror cinema, or just cinema in general.
Absolutely.
And now we have this modern take where Eggers is just a visionary filmmaker who, love him or hate him. I think everybody can look at his films and see that this is someone who is a master of their craft, who is making decisions based off of his own artistic viewpoints and has a intentionality behind his filmmaking and a story to tell, whether or not you agree with it. He comes in to make an adaptation of Dracula, but also a remake of Nosferatu, but also his own film, and also a modern take on all of these stories. That's so many things to put into one movie that it seems like it would be impossible to pull off in a way that was going to be satisfying. And yet, this movie was spectacular. I really had a great time watching it. And it's such an interesting look at adaptation and what can happen as a story changes hands and changes form. And Dracula becomes Orlok, and all these things shift over time, and yet there's so much of the original DNA of Dracula in there too. And I never want to lose sight of that.
Yeah, absolutely. And culture and society changes as well over the course of 100 years, 100 plus years. And you see how each artist is kind of commenting on their time. And I think that'll be interesting to dig into with Eggers' versions, because it just does fundamentally change. That he made some changes that I think most horror fans hearing that Nosferatu, or cinema fans in general, film historians would say, oh no, don't touch this masterpiece that meant everything. But he's bold enough to make some changes here that I think were smart and interesting, and it changed the story in ways that I don't think anybody would have predicted, which is nice for people who are very familiar with Nosferatu. But I think also notably updating it for the current audience. Like, it's got much more of a scare element than I think any of the other things that we've covered recently. It's like meant to be a horror film. And it's meant to like recapture, I think, some of what, like, I heard Eggers talk about this actually. He spoke about the evolution of vampires in cinema from sympathetic to sort of like anti-heroes, and then into straight up heroes, and then into, your Edward Cullens that are like romantic figures. And he's trying to, I think, recapture and bring it back to that horror element. There is like a psychological and like a sophistication Orlok speaks in this film, which he didn't, as far as I know, in any of the other iterations. Which that Werner Herzog one, in my research, we're going to have to do.
Yeah, I want to watch that one.
We have to do that as a bonus episode, in my opinion.
We will.
Because also highly important for the trajectory. And then, of course, in this, Eggers is referencing multiple of these Dracula adaptations and or just iterations.
I was like, we're probably missing, or at least I'm probably missing a few things, because there are versions of this I haven't seen. So I would like to fill in those blanks.
Werner Herzog was creating a film that was so important to German film. And he himself was a German doing it in the 70s, like late 70s, reacting to post-World War II, and like just seeing all of that perspective pulled out of it. And I've heard about some of the changes and stuff. So we're absolutely going to cover that as at least a bonus episode in the future. So check that out. And if you want to check out our bonus episodes, patreon.com/film.
Yeah, a little plug there.
You can support for as little as $2 a month.
I'd love to hear everybody's thoughts, honestly, for this, because I haven't looked up a lot, but I've seen some stuff, and I'll link some into the show notes, some stuff I have seen. It seems like one of the things that has happened with this film that is sort of fortuitous for the filmmaker and for its sort of effect on culture and everything, is that it comes out at a time in which dark fantasy and romanticy is having this resurgence in pop culture. And this movie itself has hit the crowd who are into monster romances, dark romances, and their discourse around this film has given it like extra life, outside of maybe your like film critic, like aficionado crowds.
Sure.
It's reached pop culture in a way that some Eggers films never really do. I find the discussion around it really interesting. I can't like give it all sort of equal representation here on the podcast, but I have seen that there is a lot of discussions out there about consent, about Ellen in particular and her choices towards the end of this movie, which, by the way, we're not going to spoil just yet. We'll give a spoiler warning in case you haven't seen anything. But there's just a lot of questions about her relationship that develops and is displayed, and how we should feel about it as an audience. And I think that's really fascinating. It's caused some really interesting discussions online, and it's just fun to see a movie like this getting sort of main pop culture focus in a way that you usually only get the big tentpole movies.
Yeah. So I guess my reaction to the film, absolutely loved it. Eggers' attention to detail, the set design, the atmosphere he creates with the cinematographer, the lighting choices that they go with. There's so much that we're going to dig into here, but I just found myself completely pulled into the film. I think that there are a few things along the way that I'll touch on that are like just significant changes, but overall, I came out being like, all right, Eggers did it again. He's one of these like masterpiece creating filmmakers right now. Like everything he makes is absolutely worth watching. He's definitely got that singular vision,
and he's divisive. But I think great filmmakers should be right. Like I think not everyone's going to connect with great filmmakers because they're making bold choices, and he definitely does. And they don't always land with me, but they tend to. I also agree. I think he's one of my favorite filmmakers right now. But I can totally recognize some people do not connect with his material.
Sure. But
that's one of the reasons I like it. Like, I don't know, it makes it kind of cool to me because it's like it's not for everybody, which is kind of a cliche thing to say, but I think it's totally true with his work.
Yeah, and I think it's like he's speaking to us, like he's making these like folklore versions of these like fantastical worlds that are like always like very accurate to like the areas they take place in or the time period. Like those are like the details that he goes into that are like non-negotiables. He's like, all of this has to happen, and then I progress from there. And like I think he loves to, and we can talk about this more, but he loves to delve into like the psyche of characters and go more internal. And I think that in the past, Nosferatu specifically, there's like an external element to it where like it's like seeing what Orlok or Dracula, their presence does to society or people in general. And I think this film becomes, because of some of those decisions that you're talking about, some of Ellen's choices early, it makes it much more about like this small knit group of people. I read that Eggers like he's a longtime fan. He got like a VHS copy of Nosferatu when he was a kid, and it didn't have sound on it, so he watched it without sound, and he said that it made it feel like very like real and like grounded in ways. And I know you were talking about how the repetitive nature of the score.
Yeah, I didn't love the score that was on there, but I actually, somebody commented on, I think on like Blue Sky or something, about how they were going to see a showing of it that had a live orchestra, and you had mentioned that was a thing that people do, and I was thinking about how that probably would be a really cool experience.
Definitely, yeah.
I've
done a couple of those. Great, amazing experience.
Really?
It's so much awesome. Fun. Yeah. Also, Eggers apparently in high school directed a like high school play of Nosferatu.
Whoa.
Directed it with someone else. And then the craziest part is they were approached by the artistic director of a local theater company and then asked if they wanted to do a more professional version in their theater. And Eggers claims that this completely changed his life as he began directing plays in New York. And then that would lead to him eventually directing films.
Wow. That's so cool, man. So he has this really personal connection with this material. I love that. And like I've heard a couple of snippets of interviews with him talking about it, and it's clear that he's very aware of the Dracula connections going all the way back to the Stoker novel, but also the different adaptations of that. And I think I'm really glad that we covered the Coppola film, because we talked about in that episode that really took Dracula and made him a figure of complicated attraction, of sort of there's a sexual romantic nature to this relationship that develops between him and Mina. And at least from the version I saw of Nosferatu, that didn't really exist. So I like that Eggers definitely leans into that sexual romantic nature that Coppola brought into the film. Now, again, I don't want to fully give Coppola credit for this. There are so many adaptations of Dracula, and I'm not an expert on all of them, so I'm not saying these originated, but popularized, perhaps.
I would immediately react to that I feel like the original Nosferatu that we watched ties it, like he's creating another iteration, another like version of Nosferatu. I think he's staying closer to Nosferatu than he is Dracula, and I think in that original Nosferatu, that relationship was, I mean, while maybe it's a little more abstract because of the time period that it was being depicted, and it's a silent film, and there's a lot of like, you're trying to infer a lot of what's being said, but I do think a lot of that was there as well. So maybe even like it's possible that Coppola even took some of Nosferatu and put that into his film.
Yes, and he probably did, because he was also he's a movie guy. He's also obviously a fan of Nosferatu as well, or knows about it. I think what I'm trying to say is that it's in Coppola's film, it is more front and center. It is more...
Well, one thing I'll say to your point is that the beginning of this film starts with the relationship between these two characters, with the Dracula figure, Orlok, and Ellen in this film, Mina in Dracula. So does Bram Stoker's Dracula, the Coppola film. It starts out with this like sort of like ancient history that they share, and like connecting them at the beginning of the film. Like
the romance between the characters is front and center in that film. And it's not so in the book. And that is brought over into this as well. Now, I'm not saying it's not in the original Nosferatu, but like the overt sexuality of it reminded me of the Coppola film.
Eggers has totally said that like that was a major influence for him. The Hammer films, like the Todd Brown 1931 Dracula film was very, the Universal film was very inspirational.
I don't think I've seen that. I've probably seen clips of it, but
we have so many potential bonus episodes that spin out of this Dracula. We could just do an entire year.
Nonstop. We won't do that for those of you who maybe aren't into Dracula, but we'll revisit every now and then, perhaps. So before we move into our bio for Eggers, which is something we like to do, is focus a little bit on the filmmaker. I'll just give my final spoiler-free thoughts about the movie. I think this is a craftsman working at the highest level, who has made some bold decisions, and has created a complex, raw, impressive, vibey, atmospheric, maybe is a better word.
Yeah,
film.
Vibey is what I think you would prefer.
And I absolutely think that if you are a fan of movies, and you're a fan of art that resists sort of simple interpretations, I think this is definitely one. And I want to also say I've only seen this movie once. I waited because I wanted it to be fresh for the podcast, so I just saw it over the weekend. I haven't got a chance to see it again, and this is, for all the reasons I just said, a movie where I feel like I'm going to miss things. I haven't had a chance to revisit it and really dive into it and take extensive notes, because I don't like being the person with my phone open in the theater, so I didn't take notes during the movie.
I mean,
so
we would have to stop. We would have to stop the podcast if you were that kind of person. I just will not stand for it.
No, but at home, when I'm watching something on streaming or whatever, I can just pause it, take a note, and then resume. And if I had the ability to do that, I would that would be a different experience, and I would be able to bring some slightly different things to that. But my overall reaction is this, I think, is going to be one of my favorite movies of the year. I can't anticipate it not being. Could it be my favorite? We'll see. We'll have to revisit at the end of the year, as we often do. But I really had a great time with this, and highly recommend it.
He's the type of filmmaker that spends so much time really understanding what makes all of the characters tick, what makes the world go, what the motivations of what his specific script is going to do. And I think that along every department, you can see that, like you said, highest level of difficulty and highest level of execution. You're seeing someone who clearly loves the material, someone who's a nerd for film, which I'm just always, anyone who's a student of film, then creates film. I feel like most directors fit in those parameters, but you can just tell sometimes that somebody loves something and they're not doing it to just get something out there that's going to make money. He's doing something that is pushing boundaries, is trying to do something different with material that he wants people to go back and watch as well, right? He's not trying to one up the original Nosferatu.
Yeah.
He's trying to do something that is a love letter to it. And I think he does that. And I think you can see with films like The Witch and The Lighthouse that he is just this type of filmmaker that is worth your time. And maybe you're not going to agree with everything that happens, and you may be shocked, you may be bored or whatever, but I've never been bored. I'm just saying maybe some people are. He's the kind of filmmaker that's just aspirational. You see someone like this and you're man, so in control of his art and so impressive, and hearing him speak about it too, you're just oh my God, he's thought about every single detail of this film, and it just oozes that.
And he's someone who is clearly capable of getting some really iconic performances, because I think Lily-Rose Depp here was the absolute standout, and gives I mentioned the word raw before. I think her performance is raw. I think her performance is physical. It is wrenching. It's really quite spectacular to watch. And all credit to her. I think there's probably a sense of wanting to prove that you're not just kind of a nepo actor, and that you deserve your role in Hollywood. And I think she kills it here, and is capable of a performance that is the standout in an already spectacular film. So I was really taken with her, and really with a lot of the performances, but I think she's the one that is going to stay with me the most.
I mean, she and transformational Bill Skarsgård, who
he
would
was
be
cool,
forgiven for not knowing that it's even Bill Skarsgård. Right?
I mean, but you should know, because he does these kinds of roles so well.
Absolutely, yeah. I agree with you. I mean, Lily-Rose.
Do we want to do our Orlok impression? I am appetite. I don't know.
Have you seen the meme on TikTok about Orlok that got popular? All right. There's this person who did the voice very well, and that's the only way I can do it. But he goes, I have to get into character.
Okay.
You must bounce on it, crazy style.
He does a lot of like,
you must bounce on it. A lot of breathing, that kind of thing. Yeah. Anyway.
Yes.
So, but it's interesting too, like, just talking about that, the nature of what I assumed going into a Nosferatu film directed by Robert Eggers was that the sex element of it and the sexuality nature of it would play more traditionally sexy. And this is like, I mean, we've been talking about the juxtaposition between like desire and disgust, this and all through Dracula. This is fucking all the way up to 11. It's like the farthest that you can go with it. And like, it's like meant to make you feel uncomfortable. It's also, I think, still calling back to a lot of those allegories that are possibly built into the character that some of the artists were putting into it. And overall, I think like he nails this character, and I think kind of roots it back in that Transylvanian lore. Like he said specifically, like no one had ever made a Dracula that looked like he was from Transylvania. So he like very specifically went and made and like had this like Baltic accent and all of those things, and the giant mustache that actually is a reference back to Stoker's material.
Yeah, that was in the book.
Yep.
Yeah, love that.
So yeah, we're talking about Eggers a lot. He's an American filmmaker, largely known for writing and directing historical fiction films. His most notable works are the horror film The Witch, The Lighthouse, Nosferatu, as well as the action film The Northman.
So I have seen all but The Lighthouse from that list. I saw The Witch fairly recently. I didn't see it when it originally came out. And I absolutely loved it. The Northman was a lot of fun to see in the theater. Another just standout film for me. And then now this is also spectacular, so I just really need to see The Lighthouse now, apparently.
You do need to, but I will say that The Lighthouse, I would say, is maybe his least approachable film, but also one of the most rewarding films that he's made.
Sure.
But I would say The Northman is such a crazy film because it's like a departure from that horror, and it's this like pure aggro adrenaline, like
it's Viking mythology on display, yeah.
Yeah, it's a pretty wild movie, and it was divisive is the reason I bring it up. Like I remember a lot of people didn't like it. I remember that like it didn't do super well at the box office.
It's kind of bombed, yeah.
You know, that's not a reason to not see it. I think that movie's actually got a lot of amazing stuff in it.
Yeah, I mean, it's got some, even just, I remember the Berserker raid sequence is just an unbelievable piece of filmmaking that you should totally watch just for that.
The Berserker raid, and it's played for like a lot of that is played for like a oneer, and there's a oneer in this film too when Hutter first gets to Transylvania, and there's all these Romani people who are performing that extent sequence. Apparently those were all non-actors. They were just performers and musicians and dancers and stuff like that. And they choreographed it, had to shoot it like 30 times. So like you can see that again, if you haven't seen Eggers films, I'm trying to paint a picture of like these like long, extended, well choreographed, like just bizarre sequences that like make you really entranced and pull you into this film and make you feel like you just fall right into it. Yeah. He's definitely that kind of person. So he was born in New York City, and he attended the American Musical and Dramatic Academy in 2001. He gained an interest in designing, directing, and theater while there, and would additionally show an interest in filmmaking by directing and designing short films. His childhood in New England often inspires his work. While writing his first feature film, he frequently visited the Plymouth Plantation in Massachusetts. And then I've already talked about his high school Nosferatu direction of the play, which is just so crazy that he carries this film so closely to him. And he's been developing this film. That the next thing he wanted to do after The Witch in 2015. There's a couple quotes that I found about that where he said, "You feel like a bit of an asshole having only made a few films, taking on such an important title." So he's just like, he was very aware of the like how legendary this film is in terms of like importance in cinema history and everything.
It seems like he kind of identified like, you know, maybe I'm not ready yet and I need to get a few more films under my belt.
Definitely a part of it. It's like some like scheduling issues and definitely some of that, but he, one way or another, he did eventually decide to do a couple other films first.
Yeah.
So he began his career as a designer and director of theater productions in New York before transitioning to working in film. He wrote and directed the horror film The Witch in his feature film debut, and it premiered at the 2015 Sundance Film Festival before A24 acquired it. Critical reception was largely positive, and the film earned over $40 million against a $4 million budget. I think that's also something notable because in today's day and age, like if you're going to take risks, you have to also guarantee that you're going to take money. So horror operates in this really cool space where like often horror makes money, and it's it can be fairly low budget, and people like to go see it in the theater and have those reactions with everyone.
Which, by the way, I was glad I was able to still see this in the theater, even as long now as it's been out, because it feels like a movie that was as we often say, I think the best way to view it is in the theater.
Right, as with any film.
Yeah,
I would say.
I would say most films. I'll say maybe
I don't know,
a few
man.
are, but yeah,
I can't think of any films that are going to be like worse because of them being in a theater. I don't know.
Yeah,
but
I have to think about it.
Anyway, that space is just. I love that. Like the reason a lot of people feel that we're having a resurgence in horror and like this like epic horror, these like I don't know, art house horror films is because they can operate in that space. And like, that's proof in the pudding right there. 40 million off a $4 million budget. It's pretty amazing. But like the quality is there as well. Obviously, like we both said, that movie's incredible. His next film, The Lighthouse in 2019 was also a period piece and received critical acclaim. He directed the film from a screenplay he co-wrote with his brother Max. In 2022, the Amleth-inspired Viking epic film The Northman was released. Critical reception was largely positive, but the film underperformed at the box office and did not make a profit until it was released on VOD. He very quickly, those 3 films all hit pretty well with critics.
Yeah.
And like most of them made money. Then he gets to create this Nosferatu film. Like I said, it was originally set to be produced in 2019. And here's another quote about around that time. He said, "It feels ugly and blasphemous and egomaniacal and disgusting for a filmmaker in my place to do Nosferatu next. I was really planning on waiting a while, but that's how fate shook out. And then eventually he opted to delay it." So that's kind of where he's come to at this point.
I know I've been hearing about this film for a long time. It's cool that it's actually here now.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. I mean, I just can't believe we've got another version of Nosferatu in 2024.
Before Grand Theft Auto 6?
Yeah,
I agree.
Exactly. The meme, of course. Couple of things that I'm excited about. Apparently, he has been developing a medieval film called The Night, which is yet to be reproduced. And then in January of 2025, so this past month, it was reported Eggers would direct Werewolf, a werewolf horror film set in 13th century England. The film's North American release is currently set for Christmas 2026.
Sick.
So that's exciting.
I'm excited for that.
I mean, he's going to do a Dracula. He's going to do a
werewolf.
Wolfman.
Yeah.
Like, let's do it. Yeah.
He's got witches already, lighthouses. Let's keep it up. Keep hitting all the major horror staples.
I also read that he said that he refuses to make a film set in the contemporary era, claiming that the idea of him photographing modern technology disgusts him. When asked what is the soonest he's willing to film, he answers that he will go as far as the 1950s.
Okay.
So,
all right, man.
Plan to see that.
Yeah, I like that. I like someone who's just like, nope, not doing it. Do all my stuff's period.
He knows what he's good at, man, and he's definitely good at it. I think he also like loves digging into the lore of all this, because that's what he does with this film. He digs into the lore of like people who actually believed in vampires, which you brought up way back in our Bram Stoker coverage. He read these texts. He goes into the lore. He goes into what people are talking about with like what acts of violence they would do on people and all these other things. So I love that he's like staying within that space and building out a larger lore, which he absolutely does with this film with regard to like the Romani people, I believe, and some of the things that their rituals and things that they're doing, and some of the vampire lore, and then honestly into the occult, which we talked about in our Nosferatu Symphony of Horror. The occult elements are definitely, he saw that, and I'm sure he's always loved that, and he leaned heavily into it. Pulled it into like a demonic possession territory, which I'm excited to talk about. It's reported that he's going to write and direct a sequel to the 1986 film Labyrinth, which is one of my favorites from when I was a kid.
About that is wild to me. I'm so interested to see what that looks like. It's one of those things that like I know a lot of people get upset when they hear about their like favorite thing from childhood getting a modern adaptation. But whenever I hear something like that attached to a director that I have as much respect for as I do Eggers or several other, that's where I'm just like, put that on hold, because I'm excited to see what this person's going to do with it.
So Eggers wrote the screenplay for this film, and reading into some of his methodology and how he went about writing it, and he stated that vampirism and Dracula is the thing that he's been thinking about and looking at for a long time. He said, quote, "I had read Montague Summers as a teenager and many other authors of vampire lore, but I think until I set out to make Nosferatu, I was still too contaminated by the cinematic tropes. And so you're infusing things you're reading with cinematic tropes that aren't there. In doing the research to write this script, I needed to be disciplined to forget what I knew. And then you start looking at the really early vampire accounts and you're like, they're not even drinking blood. They're just strangling people or suffocating people or fucking them to death." And that was really interesting.
Wow, okay.
So again, he's doing the deep dives and looking at the real dark shit, to figure out what he wants to do with these vampires. So I
assume they're still, because to me a vampire has to be draining life essence in some way. That to me feels essential. Otherwise, to me, it's not a vampire anymore.
I agree, but I guess these are accounts of what these people were afraid of, and then maybe they were tying them to vampires, or maybe it's not always sucking the blood or whatever.
Well, even if it's not blood, it could still be absorbing something about the life essence. Maybe it's just not through the blood. Maybe blood got introduced at some later date, or only in certain mythologies. I could see that. I
was talking about before that he wanted to go with more of the folk vampire, the one that was like true to the Transylvanian nobleman sort of heritage. Mm-hmm. So they set out to dress him in authentic Hungarian attire from the 16th century. Costume designer Linda Muir sought inspiration from the Transylvanian military from around 1560 to the mid-1600s, incorporating pieces of clothing such as dolman, menti, or kalpak, which are the tunic, overcoat, and hat of Orlok's costume.
Wow. Yeah.
And then conceptualizing Orlok, they got it like a ancient Romanian count. Eggers made the decision to have him speak a reconstructed form of Dacian or Dacian language in the film, while Romanian and Romani are spoken by the other Transylvanian residents.
Very cool, man. It made Orlok really stand out, and it just reminds me of how I was thinking about how this film also benefits from not being an adaptation of Dracula, even as it is one, because Dracula is one of those names that is so loaded now. It has so much cultural sort of capital to it, right, that when you say, I'm going to see a Dracula film, everyone knows what that is. Even if what you end up seeing is completely different than what you expect, you're walking into that movie with so many preconceived notions.
Right. I mean, it's I want to suck your blood.
Yeah, just so much. You got Count Chocula. You got everything, right? It's just everywhere. But like you say, it's Nosferatu. And you rename all the characters, and you're touching on this like 20s film that is like, for film geeks, yeah, super something familiar, but like nowadays people aren't talking about it that much. He was able to come in with this like stealth adaptation of Dracula, and he's really making a Dracula film to some extent, and yet he doesn't have to worry about, that's not Dracula, which there would be a million people talking about whether or not this was Dracula. But by saying this is Orlok, it's not Dracula, he can sort of get around a lot of that.
Well, I even heard Eggers talk about Dracula and why he didn't make a Dracula film is that there's some things in the film that he feels are inconsistent or he didn't like.
Sure.
And that's why he didn't make a Dracula film. And he actually also, it was funny, talking about some of the references, he actually said Dracula Dead and Loving It, which is a Leslie Nielsen movie, like a comedy, like airplane kind of send-up of Dracula films. Okay. And he said that was an influence because it draws attention to the ridiculous side of Dracula and some of the tropes that like kind of don't work. And he's like, so that you can kind of avoid that and craft something within the rest of the space of what this kind of character has to offer. He also noted that like the idea of a Orlok or a Dracula, a vampire of the time, was almost like a zombie. And he's like, I tried to make like a zombie vampire because it's like completely drained of blood and like it's barely surviving.
Very
That's kind of
undead.
what some of the accounts,
yeah,
right. Kind of what some of the accounts of what people thought, vampires may have been that believed in it.
Well, he really leaned into the I mean, this is something that was present in Dracula, the disease angle. But I think it was even more on display in the 20s film. And definitely on display here where it really felt like disease was front and center as a fear that pervades the film. Disease and death. Disease as being a manifestation of death, which obviously Orlok is in this movie.
Right. Yeah, I mean, we talked about some of like the stereotype stuff that was built into Orlok in the original film, but also such a heavy thing there is like they were coming off the heels of 1918, the pandemic, the Spanish flu.
Yeah.
And they were fearing that at the time. And you could see actually some of the characters in that Symphony of Horror film were wearing masks because it was so big. And then obviously like people, there's body after body that are like all over town and everything like that. And I think it's interesting that like obviously the rats spreading the plague, all of that kind of thing is built into that story. And I think that also goes back into Dracula, but played up even more in Nosferatu, and then I think in this film. While that aspect is there in this film, it's maybe the least talked about aspect in terms of like telling the story of Nosferatu. That was such a big part of the climax of the original 20s film, and here it's kind of just background for what's going on in the larger sense.
I think so. I do think it connects to Orlok being the personification of death, though.
Right.
So I think that's the way it really does feature prominently, I guess.
Yeah. You were seeing characters in this film react to the plague and try to avoid it and everything like that. In the other film, it seemed like they were just like the whole town was driven mad by it because Nock was being blamed as well for like a lot of what was going on in that original film. They were like chasing him down. The whole city's doing that. And then this film just kind of changes it because of what we know about Orlok's motivations and like what's actually happening.
I mean, there is still some of that. They're definitely chasing Nock down. You see the streets are filled with people who are dying. There is a plague that breaks out in the city,
right?
Attached to this.
I mean, you've already touched on Lily-Rose Depp a little bit, but her performance and getting into the aspect of like possession that I've already referenced a little bit. It is this physical performance that she gives, and like I guess it's always kind of a physical performance with Mina in the Dracula films and then Ellen in these films.
Yeah.
But this one is like full on possession. Like she's doing like complete like seizing and like, you know, mouth manipulation and all these crazy faces and eyes and things that she's it's just honestly like something that I didn't know that she was capable of. Like I'd seen her in a couple of things.
Transformative. I mean, her whole like face and look is just skull-like throughout a lot of the movie, honestly, and just the turmoil. She plays this like gothic romantic figure so well too, like the gothic woman who is not believed by the men around her, who is constantly her like worries are downplayed and she's kind of like pushed aside to the detriment of everyone. And her frustration with that builds throughout. And then, so I'm always worried, like, we haven't quite gotten to spoiler territory yet. So I guess I'll leave some thoughts about her, but I guess I'll just say, I think she is the performance that stands out to me most. Spectacular.
Eggers said that Lily-Rose Depp brought him to tears during her audition. He explained, quote, "I had a meeting with Lily, and she just impressed me so much. She understood the script so well. She had seen every major Dracula adaptation and a lot more obscure ones, and I knew we were on the same page. Back then, we did an audition, a screen test, and it was just as raw and powerful as what she's doing on screen. I'm not exaggerating. I was in tears because her audition was so insane. She's just a disciplined, courageous, and like feral actor. She's amazing." I did see that originally this was going to be Anya Taylor-Joy's role, and based on other scheduling things, things moved around over the course of a few years, and then he was able to find Lily-Rose Depp for this performance. Luckily, right? Like she absolutely nailed this one.
Yeah, I mean, Anya Taylor-Joy is a fantastic performer, and I'm sure would have been good in this role, but it's hard for me to look at what I think was the standout performance from this film and say like, oh, I wish it could have been something. Like, no, she absolutely nailed it. So that's lightning in a bottle, and you can't guarantee that would have been the case with anybody else.
Yeah. So Nicholas Hoult played Thomas Hutter. Mm-hmm. We talked about Hutter and we talked about Harker in these films, and you know, even Francis Ford Coppola admitted that Harker was not like a role that was very big, and he didn't think it was that big of a deal. Mm-hmm. He cast Keanu, and famously that was our least favorite performance in that film, and I think a lot of people's least. But I think Nicholas Hoult, they recontextualized Hutter. They you know, there's always like a love triangle in Nosferatu between Ellen Hutter, Thomas Hutter, and Orlok. But I think played up really well here. The Nicholas Hoult like extended sequences in the castle, and then like him coming back and actually being relevant to the plot, like nearing the end. I thought he brought a lot to the role. I'm a fan of the actor. I just thought like I bought their chemistry between Lily-Rose and Nicholas, and then I like his fear of Count Orlok through the film was like so palpable and so real.
This was the most interesting version of this character I think I've seen, because I do find him to be kind of forgettable. But yeah, I mean, I enjoyed what he brought here. The sequences of him in Orlok's manor castle were spectacular. I really love those parts of the film. We
talked about Orlok a little bit. Anything else you want to say about him?
I mean, what a transformative, bizarre, otherworldly performance by Bill Skarsgård. He continues to be an incredible performer, especially for these villainous, monstrous, transformative roles. Obviously, famously Pennywise in It, which was our first project we ever did on the podcast. So it's cool to see him again, and really like unrecognizable here. I kept looking to like recognize him as Bill Skarsgård, and I never really do. He just looks like a different person. I would never have known it was him if I didn't know. You know what I mean?
Voice is so convincing. He worked with like opera singers and stuff to like completely disguise and change his voice, his mannerisms. It's not like he's playing Pennywise, but he's a Dracula character.
Completely different character.
Completely different creature.
Yeah.
And he I mean, if he only played bizarre creatures for his entire career and they were all as different as Pennywise and Orlok are, I'm all the way in. I'm all the way in. Like, he's absolutely great.
Yeah, he's really good. He's really good at this stuff. And, you know, it's not the kind of thing that's going to probably win an Oscar or anything, but, like, it's such a cool performance. And it's such a cornerstone of this film working the way that it does.
There's a prosthetic penis at one point, which is quite
Spoiler.
surprising to some people. Yeah, that is pretty much the entire plot there. So sorry for spoiling the movie.
Yeah.
I did hear that Nicholas Hoult got that as a gift at the end of Wrap. He got given
hilarious.
the prosthetic penis framed from Robert Eggers. So and he says he has it in his house somewhere. So pretty much the best Wrap gift you can get.
Okay.
A few other notable people that are in the film. Aaron Taylor Johnson plays Friedrich Harding, whose home they stay in. I think sufficiently, I guess, smarmy at times, and then also like you feel for some of the stuff he goes through. I think he gives a good performance here.
Yeah, I think he's solid. He's an actor who I always feel like is on the cusp of greatness. But maybe hasn't quite got there yet. And I think this is another role where it was really good, maybe not great, but like, I don't want to talk about what happens with the character because that's spoilers, but yeah, I like him.
Sure. Willem Dafoe, frequent collaborator of Robert Eggers, Willem Dafoe.
Yeah, and he's so cool. Like I was convinced, and I mentioned this in our Patreon, I thought he was going to play Knock. To me, that was like what I expected from him, just that completely unhinged performance. And instead, we get the Van Helsing stand-in. What even is his name here?
Albin Erbhart von Franz.
Von Franz instead of Van Helsing, but okay.
Yep.
It's so funny how like the names are like so similar, but slightly different. I liked him here, and it was kind of cool to see him as he's really one of the like characters we're supposed to like most in the film. I think we find him to be like a source of safety, and you know we can debate how true that is, but I think that the film positions him to be, you know, he's got wisdom. He knows what's going on. He's likable. He likes cats. We like cats. All of these things make us connect with him as a character.
I also do love that they give him a fair amount of leeway to just give his Willem Dafoe craziness. That like the guy's unpredictable. He's got like an edge to him that you don't know where that's coming from. Definitely, you know, a very Willem Dafoe-esque character. We covered Poor Things recently, and I think about like what he did in Poor Things and then here, and he's pretty transformative as well, and I love seeing him in films like this. He just plays these wacky characters as well. Yeah. Emma Corrin played Anna Harding, who is like kind of, I would say, the Lily transfer from the Dracula film, but she obviously like is, I would say that like Lily and Mina are combined obviously for Ellen.
Yes, and that's what that was going to be my one pushback, because I really think Lily and Mina are both represented by Ellen, but there's elements of sorry, you're saying Lily, it's Lucy.
Sorry.
Lucy, there's elements of Lucy that are in Anna, of course, like, I mean, with her fate and what happens with her, but a lot of what makes Lucy sort of symbolically interesting in Dracula, and being the one who has the three suitors and being the one who maybe is a little more loose with her sexuality, a lot of that is with Ellen in this version, I think, is a little more tied to Ellen. And
then I'd just give us an opportunity to talk about Ralph Ineson, played Wilhelm Sievers. He's got that crazy voice. Good gravitas.
It was so cool to see him, especially after just like the most recent thing I think I saw him in was The Witch, honestly, and like he is such a like different character in The Witch. It's fun to see him here.
And then Simon McBurney plays Knock. Excellent performance here, character actor.
What a wild performance by him. Yeah, I don't know that I recognized him. I was like, his face doesn't look that familiar, but I'm like, maybe I've seen him in something else. I don't know. He was really good.
All right, it's time we move into the plot now. Yep. Full spoilers. We're going to talk about everything that happens in the movie. And realistically, we're going to talk about everything that happens in the original Nosferatu and some of the Dracula films as well. Yep. So
it's all fair game.
Fair warning. In the early 1800s, young Ellen pleads for a supernatural being to ease her loneliness. Her cries awaken a mysterious creature who makes her pledge herself to him eternally. In 1838, Ellen has married Thomas Hutter, and the couple live in the German town of Wisburg. Thomas accepts a lucrative commission from his employer, Herr Knock, to sell the decrepit Grunwald Manor to the reclusive Count Orlok. Ellen, disturbed by a pleasurable dream of marrying death, begs Thomas to stay to no avail. He leaves her in the care of his wealthy friend Friedrich Harding and his wife Anna, along with their two young daughters. Arriving at the Carpathians in Transylvania, Thomas is shunned by the local peasantry for associating with Orlok. That night, he witnesses a group of Roma exhuming and impaling an alleged vampire corpse with a stake. The following morning, he finds the village deserted and his horse gone. He continues on foot until an unmanned carriage carries him to Orlok's castle.
Yeah, so starting this movie off the way that it begins, centering this sort of relationship between her and this manifestation of death, it really sort of touches on this trope that is quite prevalent in a lot of German media, but I think just in a lot of Gothic media in general. That's the maiden and death. So there's a lot of paintings that depict like a woman with like a skeleton or with a demonic looking figure, or a figure that represents death. Often they are depicted as having some sort of embrace or having some sort of like sexual relationship. And I think obviously that is a motif that we're going to continue to come back to. I think it's at the heart of this movie. And I love that she introduces this complicated relationship, because you mentioned it as a love triangle earlier, and it kind of is and it kind of isn't, right? Because like Orlok is definitely monstrous here, and you can look at the whole idea that she is like asking for him to come to her and she's asking for this connection, but what she gets is not what she asked for, right? Like she's asking heaven, she's asking God, and she instead receives this demon. So it's a punishment, and it's like she's asked for it, but it's like in the same way that like she's not. It brings up questions of consent. Like she wants this to happen, and yet she withdraws consent because what happens is not what she actually wants, and then he continues to pursue anyway. And so even as we view this as a dark romance and romancing a monster, there's definitely an element of coercion here too. It's not like there's a love story. And in fact, at the end, which we haven't gotten to yet, she ends up choosing to lean into this. That is a very complicated decision that we'll have to revisit when we get there. But it touches on all of this.
And especially in comparison to like Bram Stoker's Dracula, where it's like clear that becomes a love story and like that becomes consensually a love story.
Are you talking about the Coppola film?
Coppola's Bram Stoker's Dracula.
Yeah, okay.
This idea of like what she is reaching out to, what she receives. It seems that, because she talks about it too, she says that he's sweet originally. She says that like at first he's sweet and he's like, a connection for her, and they create this relationship and they create this bond. But then we fast forward through all of that as the viewers. We fast forward to when she's like being haunted in her marriage by something she agreed to when she maybe shouldn't have had the agency to do, like as a child.
Well, it's a gray space anyway, because she was a child, but also like she talks about she's marrying death. She sees visions of like everyone she knows and cares about being dead, and yet she feels joyous about it. And a lot of this is sort of dismissed by Hutter here, but it shows that there is I think supposed to be this is supposed to be operating in a gray space where it's hard to say for sure how she feels about it, and I think it's because she doesn't even know herself. And it talks a lot about that sort of paradoxical attraction a lot of people feel towards dangerous figures,
right.
and even like killers, and people that are bad for them. All of us, right, in some way are drawn to things that are destructive to us in our lives. And this is playing in that space and talking about how even though something is bad for us, sometimes we are drawn to it, and yet that attraction to it doesn't necessarily make it a good thing either. And to say that it's a good thing is also misguided, I think.
And you could layer in the conversation we've been having about disgust, desire, those two things, like where those two things meet, and then you're adding in the element now of like almost like an addiction, or like something, like you said, like something unhealthy that you're drawn to, like that all of that can be tied in as well. I do want to talk about too with the beginning of this film. I mean, like this film is just gorgeous. They shot it on film, 35 millimeter film, and they use filters for a lot of these nighttime moonlit sequences to pull out the reds and the yellows and leave in like mostly this blue light.
We talked a lot, and one of the things I said was like, is he going to do black and white? And I love that the way he kind of did black and white is he just said like any sequence that happens at night is going to be lit by this sort of blue only, which makes it feel kind of black and white, because the black and white films often had kind of a blue tint to them. And and yet, you know, occasionally someone will like light a candle or something, and the light can sometimes, you know,
Right.
invade that. But like for the most part, it's the night sequences that are black and white. But he's able to convey a lot of those original sort of vibes from the movie. But then there's daytime sequences that are in full color.
Right. This is a filmmaking thing, and realistically just a biology thing. If you may have learned this in biology class, within your eye there's rods and cones, right?
Yeah.
And like
I've heard
the
the terms.
rods the rods are used at nighttime.
Mm-hmm.
The rods are used to see in darker areas. The cones are used to see color and to see brighter. Our brains, when you're looking at something at night, you're actually viewing it in kind of a black and white, bluish, grayish kind of area, and your brain is filling in some of the colors that you know should be there,
right,
in a crazy way. I heard the cinematographer Jaron Blashka talk a lot about this actually, and he was saying that like they were very, very specifically trying to pull the color out of nighttime sequences as your eyes actually do. Mm-hmm. And what's so cool is that for some of the time they're shooting it during the day, and like they're able to create these really eerie looking nighttime sequences. Like I'm thinking of like specifically when he's on the road, when he's walking on foot and that carriage comes up, and he's got that, they have that really strong light over top. I assume they'd lit that as well, but the just that use of the shadow, and that's what I'm getting to here as well in this first opening sequence where we see Ellen, like I love the way that the curtains are flapping, and then we're just seeing the shadow of his influence in those curtains, and she's like being like strangled basically by him.
Like, isn't she kind of lifted up? Yeah.
And like, you know, the looming shadow of his hand over the city, eventually we get some of that, and the looming up the stairs, like you're going to get a lot of those Nosferatu, like there's like elongated shadows and supernatural looking perspectives. So of course references to the original material and like the legacy of that.
So many of them, and I was so happy that I was able to recognize a lot of them because we covered it, like all the crosses on the beach that are just like, I forgot to mention how just like random and bizarre that was, and I was so glad that they were here.
Another thing that I meant to mention in our bonus episode with Nosferatu 2 is I feel like in all the Dracula and Nosferatu adaptations we've covered for this project, everyone's smoking out of these crazy devices. So Willem Dafoe gets this, he has this wild pipe later, but I meant in the original Nosferatu, there's this almost like fishing rod sized pipe that somebody's smoking out of, and like all these contraptions at the turn of the century that people were smoking out of, and I'm like, dude, they just wanted to smoke out of anything.
Yeah. That's fun.
I just thought that was worth noting. It's fitting for the time.
So one of the big differences I wanted to touch on here is because we see him travel to Transylvania, and a lot of this is so far very similar, and even like the Carpathians and like seeing the way it all looks, I was like, oh, this reminds me exactly of the 20s film and all this stuff. But then we get the sequence where he goes to stay at this place, and then he has this like dreamlike sequence where he witnesses a woman being drawn on like she's on a horse. And this introduces a topic that I think we're going to return to, and that is the idea of the like virgin sacrifice to the monster. And it seems to be that like that's what's happening here. And then it transitions into them staking a creature that is supposed to be vampiric. I love how this, and then a lot of what is about to happen at the castle, plays in the space of like, is he actually seeing this? Or is this like a dream he's having? And so much of that, like I think that really leads into that, like you were talking about expressionism and stuff, where it's like, this seems unreal. This seems like this isn't happening the way that it's being shown to us. We're seeing an expression of something that he's experiencing, and I love that, and I thought it was really effective. And like that's probably some of my favorite stuff from Hoult as the actor is. The sort of he has this look in his eyes of horror, but fascination and disbelief, and he tears up, and like he gets sort of frozen with fear, especially in Orlok's presence later. And a lot of that I thought was, that's hard to do in a convincing way, and I think he does it really well.
He definitely does. Yeah, I thought that he conveyed a lot of that fear really well.
Yeah.
And then the reveal of him having muddy shoes the next morning when he wakes up in bed, and you're like, is it real? Is it not? Well, his shoes are muddy, so
shoes are muddy.
Probably
real.
But the ambiguity there is nice. I like it a lot.
Yeah, I think we're supposed to assume that it's real, but when it's happening, you're not sure, because you're like, this feels like is this a dream? What is this?
Yeah. And like I heard Eggers talk about like Nosferatu in relation to something that you mentioned in our bonus episode, like expressionism and like what you think of typically, like Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, Metropolis, like a lot of those, like Faust. This one doesn't seem on the surface to be so expressionist, like specifically a Symphony of Horror, the 20s film. Mm-hmm. but like it's the other elements, it's the shadows, it's the performances, it's the way that like the shots are lining up to give you this otherworldly and this is something that we're getting to right now with this carriage ride. This like carriage is rolling up on him. It's incredibly tense. Then you're getting these quick shots.
I love that there was nobody driving it. That was a cool, really smart, because you get to save the Orlok and you get to build even more anticipation to the Orlok reveal.
Right. So then the horses rear up, and then like next time he like opens his eyes, and like the carriage is sideways, and like all these things that just don't.
He opens his eyes and he's like there now. Right at one point, like he like falls asleep on the carriage, but then he like opens his eyes and he's standing in front of the door. So that's another point where it's like reality is like losing all bounds now, and he's fully been sort of captured in this web, and he's being drawn in, and like I mean, there's so much I like about this movie, but that whole sequence where he is at that castle is maybe my favorite now that we're talking about it, because man, is it cool, and how much he he captures that feeling of just being so terrified of something that you can't act. You can't, like he can't even, like, I love that he doesn't write the letter that's omitted from this, because like it's in keeping with a character who's just so terrified he can't barely like take any action on his own behalf. He's so completely being dominated while he's there.
Yeah, and it's like he's helpless. He's in the presence of a god, basically. That just like
we talked about it last week, like vampire
powerless.
God, basically is what he is. Yeah.
Yeah. So that's getting us into our next bit of plot here. So I'm going to read that. Upon their meeting, the strange, menacing Orlok forces Thomas to complete the property sale. When Thomas accidentally cuts himself during the dinner, he blacks out and awakens to find bite marks on his chest. Orlok steals Thomas's locket containing a lock of Ellen's hair. He coerces Thomas into signing a document written in occult script, which Orlok implies is the contract for selling the manor. Thomas later finds the Count asleep in a coffin and fails to stake him. Becoming increasingly sick, Thomas escapes Orlok's wolves and is cared for by Orthodox nuns at a nearby church. Meanwhile, Orlok sets sail for Wisburg on a ship with plague-carrying rats, killing the crew during the voyage. Dr. Wilhelm Sievers, unable to treat Ellen's frequent sleepwalking and seizures, consults with his former mentor Albin Eberhard von Franz, a Swiss scientist ostracized for his occult beliefs. Von Franz believes Ellen is under the spell of a demonic, plague-bearing vampire called the Nosferatu. Nock is institutionalized after killing and eating raw sheep. Sievers and von Franz search Nock's office, believing he serves the Nosferatu, who is revealed as Orlok.
He also bites the head off a pigeon at one point.
Yeah,
really
yeah.
Fucking disturbing.
So you're familiar with the Texas switch as well, right? Like you can see it just leave frame and they swap it out and then he bites it, and like that's just again classic filmmaking techniques that are just always going to work. They're always fun.
And they make that pigeon look cute before he does it too.
Yeah. So you were talking about the sequences in the castle. I definitely want to highlight that. Yeah. The walk up. First of all, the voice, incredibly intimidating.
The way that it fills the soundscape too. Like it's not just the voice, but it's like the way it's used and how
there's like a
resonant
vibration
it is.
to it.
And it really gets into your bones.
They come into this room, so everything's been very blue up to this point. They come into this room that's like fireball in there, and so you can't see. They're obscuring Count Orlok often, and like the way when we do see him, we're just getting close up of his eyes, and it's just like hell. He's literally entered hell.
He's entered hell, and now he's talking to Satan. That's what it feels like. Yeah.
Absolutely. And it's so well shot, and it just like it's so unique looking, right? Like it's not a sequence that I've seen before in another
film. They really sold on the like he didn't have anybody else there, and like that worked so well here. Like sometimes it feels a little silly that like Dracula's there by himself, and that's one of the reasons why I liked that having the three wives or three women, because it's like, okay, he's not just completely alone in this castle. But like he didn't, like, I don't know, it works here. Like I don't really need anybody else.
Yeah, and the bites on the chest that we get is like another,
when he like passes out, but then he wakes up and he sees the bites, and like also like we don't see the teeth, but what we do see, I don't remember seeing the teeth. What we do see is like moments of him sucking the blood from the chest, and the gross ass sound it makes of him like slurping it out. It's like so visceral and disgusting.
And I would be remiss if I didn't talk about Orlok's penis. Like he goes down already, and it's like decrepit, like fucking. There's no moisture in this body. It's a full-on mummy.
Yeah.
And he comes out, and like it's a really surprising moment that you're just like, holy shit, and it's like so intimidating at the same time.
Yeah. It's kind of similar to the moment I think in the original film he was. This was on the ship where he like rises up out of the the coffin he's in. But it's a similar moment. He doesn't rise up in exactly the same way. He looks like you actually can kind of see him stand up, whereas like that original, he like looks like he just like kind of levitates up. But it was definitely a visual similarity there, though. I think like, that's the shot they were referencing.
I think so too, yeah. And it's like they made him very powerful and very fast, like a modern horror villain, like monster.
But it's not like he runs. It's like he can just be somewhere else. Like he almost teleports.
He moves quickly when he goes to bite and that kind of thing. Like we see it a couple times.
A couple moments,
but there's a sequence where he gets Hutter here. And he's got him down, and he's full on like humping him while he's sucking the blood out of him.
It's ambiguous because he's like he makes this like undulation of his body where he looks like he's humping, but it's like as he's making that sucking sound. So you're like, is that just what his body does as he's sucking your blood, or is something else going on? It's unclear.
Agreed, but I also think that there's a level of attraction and a level of
We talk,
and
this goes back to all of our episodes we've done so far, because if you haven't been listening, going all the way back to Bram Stoker may have been gay, may have been bisexual, and there's a lot of that he was working through with this character and his relationship to Henry Irving. And if you want to hear about all of that, go all the way back to our episode on the book.
Yeah, and in the bonus episode we talk about Murnau as well, and Murnau was also gay. So there's like a continuing legacy of like someone possibly making commentary on repressed sexuality and like that's the case for the women in the stories, as well as possibly like allegories with Dracula or Count Orlok here. So I think that the continuation of that is clear here. And like, everyone's attracted to Dracula, and Dracula seems to be attracted to everyone. And by everyone, I mean all sexes, not every single person.
But his attraction is the attraction of death, right? Like it feels like it is the inescapableness of death, too.
I don't know. It's muddied though. It's tied into sexuality, in my opinion. It's like there's like a death and also like a sex element.
Yeah, but it's like he's killing. Like I think it's notable
it's bringing
that
pleasure.
He doesn't turn anybody in this version, because that to me is always like this transmission of power, this transmission of something, right? And that's such an essential part of a lot of vampire stories. But this version to me feels a lot more concerned with Orlok / Dracula as a manifestation of death itself, and that relationship we have with death, and the attraction we all have with death, and the because it's something we're all going to experience. People can develop fascinations with it, and people can develop thoughts about it that are complicated.
But his influence on these characters is sexual in nature. Like the characters are gyrating and like rubbing themselves and orgasming,
very overtly sexual.
And like the men and the women. Like there's a scene where Hutter's doing the same. Like when he's bitten down on, like he's in, it's like there's a pleasure happening.
Right. Well, because it's like if you look at sex as, and this is reductive, but maybe at its like most basic human instinct, it's tied to procreation, right? It's tied to an act of giving life. So if you tie that instead to death, it introduces like power humans have to like seize that part of ourself and redirect it in a way that maybe it wasn't quote unquote intended. Intended sounds like cosmically, but I mean like it wasn't, it didn't evolve for that. And yet it can be pointed in that direction. And it can be pointed in a lot of directions. So maybe there's something about like directing our own sexuality, including in places like towards death. Because like a sexual attraction to death is a very bizarre thing to, I don't even consider. And yet I think that's at the heart of this movie. It's very goth too, right? Like this is such a goth movie, right? Gothic in the sense of like gothic film and gothic time period, but also goth in the sense of like wearing black and being obsessed with being, morbid.
Sure.
Yeah.
But I want to touch on Ellen and like the way that this, I think, fundamentally changes from being sort of like a, I don't know, I guess you could say in the original Nosferatu, there was like a level of attraction that reached across the ocean and all that stuff that she's feeling and his influences coming to bear. But here it's like there's like a biblically demonic or like possession happening where she cannot control her body. She goes into a trance. She's almost like taken possession of at times.
Sure.
Like he speaks through her.
He speaks through her. Yeah.
There's also notably something about like the repression of women at this time period that's carried through all of these versions, where they're like tying her to the bed and they're not listening to her, like you said, which is a gothic hallmark. But this version is like, it's so like violent and foul and like the shocking to see it in this way. And like, so that's why this Ellen figure she's just like a tragic figure. figure, because again, she didn't ask for any of this, and then she's like a reluctant hero.
Yeah, and that goes back to the thing that I commented on the novel when we first read it. How I was taken with how much I think it was Lucy really felt like she was possessed. The possession ends up killing her, right, and transforming her and killing her. And the similar thing happens with Mina, but with a different result. But how it took place over a long period of time, and it was slow in a way that I hadn't seen in other vampire adaptations. And I love to see that here as well. And in fact, it is like the most quintessential version of it, because I agree. It completely feels like we're watching The Exorcist at times. It's like she's full on being demon possessed by Orlok.
And it works, honestly, for me. Like, I wouldn't have expected it. It's a big fundamental change from the other Nosferatu, as far as I can tell, and a lot of the Dracula material. But I like it. The occult, I think that the having that occult written note, which I actually found out that Murnau and Henrik Galeen may have had ties to occult groups at the time. And so like they may have been like threading these things into their films way back in the 20s.
That's fascinating.
All right, last bit of plot here. Thomas returns to Wisburg as Orlok's plague ravages the populace. Knock escapes, killing a porter, and escorts Orlok to Grunwald Manor. Orlok appears to Ellen and confesses that while he is incapable of love, her pledge has intertwined their destinies and made his desire to possess her insatiable. The document he tricked Thomas into signing is revealed to void the Hutter's marriage. Knowing that his bond with Ellen cannot be sustained by force, Orlok says she must willingly submit to him within 3 nights, else he will kill Thomas and allow the plague to consume Wisburg. Ellen later has sex with Thomas after confessing her past with Orlok, which Orlok sees telepathically. He retaliates by killing Anna and her children. Driven mad with grief, Friedrich dies from the plague while lying with Anna's corpse. Von Franz's research suggests that the Nosferatu can be destroyed by a fair maiden's willing sacrifice. Knowing only she can stop the plague, Ellen conspires with von Franz to keep Thomas away. Thomas, von Franz, and Sivers go to Grunwald Manor, where they accidentally kill Knock after finding him sleeping in Orlok's coffin. Realizing von Franz's deception, Thomas rushes back to save Ellen as von Franz destroys the vault. Ellen summons Orlok to her bedroom and repledges herself to him, distracting him by allowing him to feed on her until sunrise. When the sunlight kills him, Thomas returns and holds Ellen's hand as she dies, while von Franz confirms that her sacrifice has freed them from the plague and Nosferatu.
Yeah, so this ends on what is considered a trope of a kind, and that's, the sacrificial woman, right? The sacrificial maiden, and it touches in on, I think Eggers is fully aware of this when he introduces it earlier in the film. He introduces the idea of this, and we see Ellen choose it in a sense, and we talked about, and I think it is heroic personally, but I think it is also kind of a complex thing to look at, because she's put in an impossible position where she knows, she's seen the death that Orlok is able to enact, and she has no choice really but to do this, right? Like, everyone's going to die if she doesn't. So she's almost compelled into this, but she still is brave in the face of that, I guess. So I do think it is a heroic act at the end, to sort of lean into it, to pledge herself to him, and I think there's an interesting discussion to be had about why she has to. Why is Orlok so concerned with her doing it willingly, and how is that all tied into the sexuality sort of metaphor?
I think because it's difficult and it's taboo and it's like, it's gross, right? Like, it's something that like no one should ever have to be put up against, and like, but like the messaging of it is troubling, obviously. But I will say, like, the text as far as this curse is concerned comes from the 22 film. Like, we get that text on screen, like the fair maiden at the crow of a cock or whatever. Yeah. All of that comes from that original material. Right. So like all of this is something that he's Eggers kind of pulling out and showing more evidence of, I think. But I think you can draw that like the same thing happens in that original 20s film. How I feel about it is conflicted, obviously. Like, should anyone have to be put in that scenario, especially unwittingly being put in that scenario from an agreement she made when she was a child? No. One of the biggest moments is like when he's like feeding, realizing that the sun is coming up and he's about to leave, and she like pulls his head back down. And I think that's that moment of like showing like real power there, and showing like she is stronger than this entity preying on everyone, like in this moment.
It's a reclaiming of power in a relationship where the dynamic has been completely the other way around, right? Like Orlok has had all the power in this. She welcomed him in at the beginning of the movie, but she didn't know. She didn't know what she was welcoming in. And then she tried to reject him throughout, but he, was unwilling to be rejected and sort of forced himself upon her. And it's only in this final act where she yields to that is she able to actually then control it, because she's able to kill him, like she's able to destroy him, but she has to destroy herself in the process. So it's a very Pyrrhic victory. It's very, victory, but at what cost, I guess.
I think another notable thing is that he's incapable of love. Like he literally tells her he's incapable of. He doesn't love her.
Yeah, he says that. Yeah, he is an appetite. He is not capable of love, but he must have her regardless.
Which makes him a force of nature, which pulls me in the direction of...
Well, and he's also death, remember? So, like, death isn't capable of love. Like,
right, but also, like, what else is being said here? I think, like, in today's modern age, we can talk about, like, what, we did talk about what Nosferatu, A Symphony of Horror, like, what some of the symbolism was in that film. We've talked about it in Dracula. Now, we're in 2024, 4 years after a pandemic, when he could have leaned heavily into the plague element like the original film did. But I don't think he really did. I think the plague element was there. I just don't think that it was played up to be like the most impending thing. I think that Nosferatu threatened that like the plague would overtake everything, but that wasn't necessarily the thing that I was leaning into. The most pressing matter was the individual struggle that Ellen was going through. And I think that's like very focused in on in this film in a way that other iterations hadn't had that happen. So I don't know. What do you think? Open question.
What's the question?
What do you think in today's day and age, like all this symbolism and allegory means? Like what do all these characters represent? Like what's the subtext here?
I think it's a great question. And honestly, I'm hesitant to come down on it, because I think this is, as I talked about at the beginning of this episode, this is a movie that I think is going to bear repeat viewings, because I think it's nuanced, and I think it was deliberately left to be interpreted and discussed. And I think what Ellen does is complex. It's clear that she is drawn and attracted to death throughout this movie. She embraces it at the end, but there's this huge element of coercion throughout. You can look at it as assault, right? You can look at it as a survivor who is trying to reclaim power. And a tragic figure who ends up sacrificing herself, whereas we see her, her male counterpart in Hutter gets to live. And we can talk about that, and like why does he get to live, and like why is she the one who has to do this? All valid questions, and I think Eggers wants us asking those questions. I think Eggers wants us to analyze it in this way, and I think it's fascinating, but I guess I don't know for sure how I feel about it, other than it's an interesting topic, I guess.
This is what we're here to do, right? Yeah. Right. It's like I will admit, one viewing I don't think is enough to get us there, but as we look back, I think it'll become easier, as it's become easier with the original Nosferatu, as it's become easier with Dracula stories as time went on. Like, I don't think anyone in those specific days and ages picked up on all of what was possibly the context of the story. And maybe we're too close to it right now. Yeah. We'll other things will reveal themselves. But for now, I do think that he's updating it for a modern audience at a time when women's rights and women repression it's rearing its head again. I mean, it's like, continue to be a thing, but right now it feels really present. It's also notable that the script was written it was written in 2019, 2018, something like that. So like, were things adjusted as time went on, and like things were happening in the culture? So we've talked about it before, but art is like inherently political. Like there's things that he's probably seeing in the world that he's imbuing into these stories.
Well, and there's always an element of like wanting to. There's some element of wanting to maintain what the original story was, and I've heard him talk about that. Like he always liked that Ellen sacrifice to kill Nosferatu from the original film. So it would have been a major departure to change that and have Ellen survive, right? It's not saying he couldn't have done it, but he didn't want to.
But he's putting pressure on other elements to make her situation feel even more suppressive in ways. So I just think I don't know. Going forward, those are the things I'll be taking with me and thinking more about.
Well, and I personally found it to be more overtly heroic, right? Like, and it's debatable how heroic it is, but I found that I was admiring Ellen as a character and her action taken at the end. I was like cheering for her, and I was sad by her fate, but what she chooses to do is it's really cool. It's impressive.
She talks a lot about like the evil inherent within her and like evil in the world, and she represents like this light possibly, and he represents this evil, but then she also has the evil within her. She's lived this like half life, this tortured life, and
her melancholy. Yeah, and then of course it's all represented visually because this is a film, and I love that with the final moment of her laying in this death embrace. She's died, and she's got this little manifestation of death atop her, and it looks like one of those paintings that I was referring to, and it looks like we see like an image that they even show in the film. The Van Helsing character when he's talking about it. I always just call him Van Helsing, but when he's talking about it, he shows an image so that we get that. But like it also evokes a lot of other famous paintings like this, and I love that that's where we end. I think it's really interesting, and I think at this point we should talk about how we feel about Nosferatu 2024 in comparison with everything else we've talked about, the original book, the other film, the older film.
Typically we choose which is best, book or movie. This is kind of an abnormal way that we're covering this. So we're just talking about everything in the project. I'm going to be brief because this episode has run a little long.
Yeah.
This film is doing things for me that like few films can. I think it's just like elevating something that is absolutely foundational to the history of cinema and horror. And like I look back at it and I can see all the hallmarks of what we're still using today to tell these stories, and the cultural context of when it came out, Nosferatu specifically, and then the way that it connects to Dracula, and then the overall Dracula lore, and like all the stuff that has gone on and the baggage with that character. The thing that I worry about with modern audiences is like a lack of like media literacy, and like specifically like art literacy and film literacy. And I think that like taking a film like Nosferatu that's not very approachable for a modern audience, modernizing it, making it popular, having people talk about it, having it go fairly viral, and having it be something that's like in the zeitgeist right now and causing conversation, I think is very important. And I think it always is going to point back to that original material. And I think that like what Coppola did with that original Dracula film went on to influence so much of what we saw with romantic vampire stories. But ultimately, like what Nosferatu is doing right now in today's day and age, for me, it's just the most compelling thing. It's something that's like, again, it's incredibly inspiring to see something so well visualized, brought to screen, and then just in general to be talking about a lot of these topics and updating these things that are universal truths and universal sort of messaging for today. I just think it's really important, and I love that he's doing it on this scale and in the studio system with so many cooks in the kitchen, and it's just very impressive. And I'm taking the film in this case.
This film.
The Nosferatu 2024 film,
gotcha. Yeah. Okay, so I will keep mine brief. I will just say last week we did this same thing for the Coppola film versus the Bram Stoker novel, and I ended up choosing the film over it, just slightly. It was, and the reasons I discussed in that episode I won't get into. So for me, the question now becomes this movie versus the other movie. Which one do I prefer? And I came down like this ultimately. I think Coppola's film is more fun. I think there is zaniness to that film. There is some wild sequences. There's some wild costuming. It's colorful. It's kind of over the top in its performances. It is a really interesting film in its own right that I had a lot of fun with. But I think this movie is better in most ways, and in ways that I think are fairly objective, but I also think in a lot of subjective ways that just appeal to me aesthetically and appeal to me and what I like in films. I find this movie to be a little more subtle, a little more complex, a little more interesting. I think this movie has iconic performances that are iconic on a different kind of level versus being sort of over the top and scenery chewing. Even though you could totally say that about Orlok here, this movie is better to me. So yeah. I'm gonna go there. I will say I think of all four things that we've talked about, the 1920s Nosferatu is probably at the bottom of the totem pole for me personally.
Yeah. How dare you?
It slides in under the novel. But these are all spectacular, right? These are all spectacular. So it's just, very subjective rating. And of course, looks like I'm liking the new things. So you can accuse me of, liking the modern stuff more because it's modern. And that's fair. But man, what a fun project this has been. We always like to start the year off with a bang, start with something kind of big and that we've been looking forward to for a long time. And I think this totally fits the bill. We hope that you stick with us for this entire season of our show. We have a lot of fun stuff planned. Right now, we're going to be getting into a Patreon selection. We don't know what it is as of recording this, but we will, by the time this comes out, we will know what we're covering. And then we have other cool things on the horizon. We're going to be doing a Bong Joon-ho film. We got just other things. So make sure to stick around for the podcast. And if you like this episode, let us know in the form of a rating and review on whatever app you chose to listen on. If you're on YouTube, like the video, share it with your friends. Make sure to leave a comment. Tell us your thoughts on all this stuff.
Yeah, and then also be sure to connect us on social media. We're on Facebook, Blue Sky, Instagram, TikTok, all of those at Ink2Film. If you think we might be on a platform, we probably are. So, hit us up on there.
I recently made a Tome account, which you probably haven't heard of.
I've never even heard of that now, dude.
There's all kinds of new social media popping up right now. Yeah.
But what I will say is we do have a Discord that we like to pop into, talk to our listeners, talk about, film, books, video games, anything you want to talk about, we're in there. It's a cool community, safe community to talk about anything you'd like to. Just send us a message on any social media platform or send us a message at ink2film@gmail.com and we will send you the code to get in there.
Yeah, we'd love to have you in there. Even if you just listened to this episode and it's first time, we'd welcome you in there. We'd also like to thank Joseph Earwicker for the use of our intro and outro music.
I had a lot of fun with Dracula. I had a lot of fun with Nosferatu. So glad that we got to cover a 1920s silent era, Weimar, German expressionist film.
It was an interesting piece of education for me. Maybe not my favorite thing we've watched, but it was an interesting thing to watch for sure.
It's incredibly important. So I'm just the film nerd in me is happy tonight. So I thank you all for listening, and until next time,
keep adapting.